Michael Luciano stood at the pinnacle of success, yet something felt inexplicably wrong. His restaurant, Luciano's Bistro, was more than just a business. It was the crown jewel of his career, a place where flavors told stories and every meal was crafted to be an unforgettable experience. The reviews online glowed with praise, the sales remained consistently strong, and his staff appeared content with their roles. By all measurable metrics, he had achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of. But lately, a nagging sensation had taken root in his mind, a persistent feeling that he had somehow lost touch with the heart of his creation. The restaurant's numbers were excellent. The kitchen ran with precision, and the dining room buzzed with satisfied customers every night. Still, something felt missing, like an essential ingredient in an otherwise perfect dish. After weeks of this gnawing uncertainty, Michael decided to do something he hadn't done in years. Instead of his usual management observations or kitchen inspections, he would experience his restaurant as his customers did. The plan was simple. He would go undercover, not as a waiter or cook this time, but as a regular patron. The transformation was subtle but effective. He traded his tailored suit for a comfortable hoodie and worn jeans, replaced his Italian leather shoes with casual sneakers, and pulled a baseball cap low over his face. Gone was Michael Luciano, the successful restaurateur. In his place stood just another customer seeking a good meal on a rainy Tuesday evening. As he walked through the doors of his own establishment, the experience was immediately different. The hostess barely glanced at him as she grabbed a menu, just another face in the dinner rush. The maitre d', who normally greeted him with deferential respect, simply led him to a booth near the back of the restaurant. Even the servers who saw him almost daily walked past without a flicker of recognition. From this new vantage point, his restaurant revealed itself in ways he'd never noticed before. The lighting he'd so carefully selected cast different shadows across the tables. The music he'd personally curated reached his ears with unfamiliar notes. He watched as couples leaned close over candlelit tables, sharing intimate conversations and bites of each other's dishes. Families gathered around larger tables, passing plates and laughing together, while business associates clinked glasses over successfully closed deals. Each table held its own story, its own moment being crafted within the walls he'd built. A cheerful waitress approached his table, her smile practiced but warm. "Good evening. Can I start you off with something to drink?" "Water's fine," Michael replied, keeping his voice casual, conscious of maintaining his anonymity. "And I'll need a few minutes with the menu." As he held the menu he knew by heart, each dish reminded him of a specific moment in his culinary journey. Every recipe represented a milestone, a flash of inspiration, a problem solved through experimentation and dedication. Or at least, that's what he'd always believed. It was then that he heard them. Two young voices from the booth directly behind him, speaking in hushed but urgent tones that caught his attention, not because they were loud, but because they carried an edge of something purposeful. "Do you think we'll even see him?" The first voice was high and anxious, like someone trying to be braver than they felt. "I don't know," came the second voice, sharper and more determined. "But Mom said this is the place. She said he comes here all the time." Michael's ears perked up, and his hands tightened slightly on the menu. Who were these boys looking for? His first instinct was to dismiss it as kids being curious, maybe hoping to spot a local celebrity. But there was something in their voices, an urgency that didn't fit with innocent curiosity. As he sat there, pretending to study the menu while straining to hear more of their conversation, Michael had no way of knowing that this ordinary Tuesday evening would become a turning point in his life. Sometimes the most important lessons come when we least expect them, and sometimes the true measure of success lies not in what we've built, but in what we've overlooked along the way. Michael kept his head down, pretending to study the menu while his attention remained fixed on the conversation behind him. The boys' voices carried an undercurrent of emotion that made his skin prickle with unease. "Em said it's his fault everything went wrong," the second boy continued, his voice hard with suppressed anger. "She said if it weren't for him, we wouldn't be living like this." Michael's heart began to pound. His fault? The accusation felt too pointed to be about someone else. He forced himself to remain still, though his hands gripped the menu tightly enough to crease the expensive paper. The waitress returned with his water, momentarily breaking his concentration. "Ready to order?" she asked brightly. I'll just have the house special," Michael managed, barely glancing at the menu he knew by heart. His thoughts were elsewhere, straining to catch every word from the booth behind him. As soon as the waitress left, the boys' conversation resumed, their voices dropping even lower. "Mom said he ruined her life," the second boy muttered. "That he took everything from her. Do you think he'll even care if we tell him?" "I don't know," the first boy whispered, uncertainty clear in his voice. "I want to see him. I want to see the guy who made us lose everything." Michael's stomach churned. The pieces were starting to come together, though the picture they formed made no sense. These boys weren't looking for just anyone. They were looking for someone they blamed for their mother's suffering. And increasingly, Michael suspected that someone was him. Unable to contain his curiosity any longer, Michael made a decision. He stood, took a deep breath, and walked toward the boys' booth. As he approached, they both tensed, their wide eyes darting up to meet his. "Hey," Michael said gently, sliding his hands into his pockets to appear non-threatening. "I couldn't help but notice you two seem a little uneasy. Is everything all right?" The boy in the hoodie straightened, his face hardening. "We're fine," Michael nodded, pretending not to notice the edge in the boy's voice. "That's good. I just thought, well, you mentioned someone earlier, someone who might be here. Are you looking for someone?" The boys exchanged a glance. The one in the baseball cap fidgeted nervously while the boy in the hoodie squared his shoulders. "Why do you care?" he asked, defensive. Michael hesitated, weighing his next words carefully. "I just thought maybe I could help. If you're looking for someone, I might know them." The boy in the hoodie narrowed his eyes, studying Michael's face. Then, as if something clicked, his expression shifted dramatically. "Wait a second," he said slowly, realization dawning in his eyes. You look familiar." Michael's heart sank. He forced a small laugh. "A lot of people say that. I must have one of those faces." "No," the boy insisted, his voice rising slightly. "You're him. You're Michael Luciano." The second boy gasped, his face paling. "Are you serious? Is it really him?" Michael felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. There was no use denying it now. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I'm Michael Luciano. But how do you know who I am?" The boy in the hoodie glared at him, his green eyes blazing with anger. "Because of what you did to our mom?" His words came out like accusations, sharp and precise. Michael blinked, taken aback. "Your mom? I'm sorry, but I don't even know." "Yes, you do," the boy snapped, cutting him off. "Angela Carter. Remember her?" The name hit Michael like a thunderclap. Angela Carter. His mind raced back through the years to a talented young woman who had worked for him as a sous chef. She had been full of passion and ideas, eager to make her mark in the culinary world. But then one day she had quit abruptly, leaving no explanation. He hadn't thought about her in years. "Angela," he said slowly, the name feeling heavy on his tongue. "She worked here, didn't she?" The boy's jaw tightened. "She didn't just work here. She gave everything to this place. She helped you build it. And what did you do? You stole from her. You took her recipes and claimed them as your own. You made sure she couldn't get hired anywhere else." His voice cracked slightly. "She told us everything." Michael stared at the boys, his mind reeling. "That's not true," he said, his voice trembling. Why would she think that?" "Because it is the truth," the boy shot back. "You ruined her life. You ruined our lives." The second boy, quieter and more hesitant, finally spoke up. "She said you were jealous of her, that you couldn't handle someone else getting the spotlight." Michael felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. He searched his memory, trying to piece together what had happened all those years ago. Had he made mistakes? Had he been so focused on building his dream that he hadn't noticed someone else's falling apart? In that moment, standing in his own restaurant, facing these two boys whose lives he had apparently helped destroy, Michael made a decision that would change everything. "I need to talk to your mom," he said finally, his voice firm but gentle. "If what she told you is true, I need to hear it from her. Please, will you let me talk to her?" The boys exchanged a wary glance. Finally, the one in the hoodie spoke. "She's not here right now, but if you really want to know the truth, you'll have to come see us." Michael nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of unknown consequences. "Then I will." As he looked at these two young faces, hardened by circumstances he might have helped create, Michael realized that success had a price he never knew he'd made someone else pay. And now, it was time to face that bill. The rain had turned into a steady drizzle by the time Michael arrived at the modest apartment complex. The building stood in stark contrast to the upscale world he'd grown accustomed to: peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, and flickering exterior lights that cast uneven shadows across the worn concrete. Each step up the metal staircase echoed with the weight of decisions he was only now beginning to understand. Standing before apartment 2B, Michael's hand hesitated over the door. Through the thin walls, he could hear the muffled sound of a television and what might have been dishes being washed. Such ordinary sounds for what he knew would be anything but an ordinary encounter. Before he could knock, the door creaked open and Jacob, the older boy from the restaurant, stood in the doorway, his expression guarded but his eyes burning with barely contained emotion. "You came," Jacob said, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and lingering distrust. Despite the challenging tone, Michael could see the boy's hands fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie, a reminder that beneath the hard exterior was still just a child dealing with adult-sized pain. "I needed to understand," Michael replied simply. He noticed how Jacob positioned himself in the doorway, protective, like a sentinel guarding his family's sanctuary. After a moment's hesitation, the boy stepped aside, allowing Michael to enter their world. The apartment was small but meticulously maintained, with the kind of careful organization that spoke of pride fighting against circumstances. Family photos lined the walls, younger versions of the boys at various ages, always with the same woman whose smile grew progressively more strained in each successive image. The air carried the lingering scent of home cooking mixed with something floral, probably from the air freshener plugged into a nearby outlet. And there she was. Angela Carter sat on a worn but clean sofa, her back straight, and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The years had left their mark. Her once vibrant auburn hair now streaked with gray, fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, but her gaze still held the same intensity that had once made her stand out in his kitchen. The TV murmured in the background, but neither of them heard it. "Michael Luciano," she said, her voice carrying years of carefully contained emotion. "I can't say I expected to see you here." There was a slight tremor in her words, whether from anger or something else Michael couldn't tell. "Angela," he began, then stopped, suddenly unsure of what to say. "How do you address years of perceived wrongs? How do you begin to understand a story you didn't even know you were part of?" "I didn't know it was you. The boys told me. They told me what you said about what happened. I need to know, did I really hurt you that badly?" Angela's eyes narrowed, and she reached for the TV remote, clicking it off with a sharp movement. The sudden silence felt heavy, charged with unspoken accusations. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked, bitter amusement coloring her tone. "Of course you don't. People like you never do." "Angela, I'm not here to argue," Michael said, his voice breaking slightly. "I honestly don't remember doing anything that could have destroyed your life. Please, tell me what happened." She laughed, but the sound held no joy. "You want the short version? Fine." She stood up, and despite being shorter than Michael, her presence seemed to fill the room. "You took credit for my work. All those dishes that made your restaurant famous, most of them were mine. I trusted you, Michael. I thought you were mentoring me, helping me grow, but you were just using me." Michael's brow furrowed, genuine confusion and distress crossing his features. "That's not how I remember it. You were part of the team, an important part, but I never claimed your work as my own." "No?" Angela's voice rose sharply, causing both boys to flinch from where they watched in the hallway. Then why did every article about Luciano's bistro mention your name and only your name? Why did you ignore my contributions? And when I finally confronted you about it, what did you do? You blacklisted me. No one would hire me after I left. The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy and poisonous. Michael's stomach churned as he tried to reconcile his memories with her words. He remembered Angela as a talented chef, someone who had brought energy and creativity to his kitchen. But had he really been so blind to her contributions? Had his ambition cast such a long shadow that he couldn't see who was standing in it? Looking at her now, seeing the life she'd been forced to build in the aftermath of their shared history, Michael felt the full weight of his privilege and success pressed down on him like a physical burden. The carefully maintained apartment, the proud but worn furniture, the way her sons watched him with years of accumulated resentment. It all painted a picture of a life that had been knocked off course, struggling to maintain dignity in the face of shattered dreams. Her words had planted seeds of doubt in his carefully constructed memories of those early days. Had he really been as fair and supportive as he'd always believed? Or had he, in his drive for success, unconsciously pushed aside those who helped him achieve it? The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken words and unrealized potential. In the background, the boys watched, witnesses to a confrontation they had helped orchestrate but could not fully understand. The rain continued to fall outside, its gentle rhythm a counterpoint to the tension in the room. Michael sank into a chair across from Angela, his mind struggling to process her accusations. The weight of her words pressed against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. Her eyes never left his face, watching for any sign of recognition or remorse. "Tell me everything," he said softly. "I need to understand." Angela's hands clenched in her lap. "Do you remember the summer seafood menu? The one that got all those rave reviews?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Those were my mother's recipes, Michael. Recipes I'd spent years perfecting, adding my own twists to her Portuguese traditions. I shared them with you because I trusted you." The memory hit Michael like a physical blow. That menu had indeed been a turning point for the restaurant. The critics had praised the innovative take on traditional coastal cuisine, calling it a perfect blend of tradition and modernity. They had called it his vision. "I remember," he said, his throat tight. "The grilled octopus with saffron aioli, the salt cod croquettes." "My family's food," Angela cut in sharply. "Dishes I learned standing on a chair in my grandmother's kitchen. And what did you do? You presented them as your own creative innovations. Michael Luciano's bold new take on Mediterranean cuisine. That's what the reviews said." Michael's face paled as the implications of her words sank in. "Angela, I never meant—" "You never meant what?" she interrupted, years of suppressed anger finally breaking through. "You never meant to take credit? You never meant for every article, every review to mention only your name? You never meant to make me feel like I was just another line cook instead of the person who created half your signature dishes?" In the hallway, Jacob and Ethan watched silently, their young faces hard with years of witnessing their mother's pain. Michael noticed how Ethan's hand reached out to grip his brother's sleeve, seeking comfort in this tense moment. "And then," Angela continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "when I finally worked up the courage to confront you about it, what happened? Suddenly, no restaurant in the city would hire me. Every application rejected, every inquiry met with awkward excuses. Do you know what it's like to have your passion, your talent, your very identity stripped away?" The silence that followed her question was deafening. Michael's mind raced through those early years, seeing them now through a different lens. He remembered conversations with other restaurant owners, casual mentions of Angela's departure, perhaps words spoken in anger or defensiveness that had taken on a life of their own. "I never blacklisted you," he said finally. But even as the words left his mouth, he understood how hollow they sounded. Intent and impact, he realized, were two very different things. Angela laughed bitterly. "Maybe you didn't make actual phone calls, Michael. Maybe you didn't explicitly tell people not to hire me. But in this industry, reputation is everything. And somehow my reputation was destroyed the moment I left Luciano's." The truth of her words hit him like a wave, washing away years of comfortable assumptions. How many times had he taken credit without thinking? How many contributions had he overlooked in his rush to build his empire? The success he'd built suddenly felt tainted, built on a foundation of unacknowledged debts. Michael stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair in agitation. The small apartment suddenly felt too confined for the magnitude of his realizations. He paced for a moment, then turned to face Angela with newfound determination. "Let me make this right," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Come back to Luciano's." Angela's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. "Excuse me?" "Not as just another chef," Michael continued quickly. "As co-head chef, equal partnership in the kitchen, full creative control over your dishes with proper credit and recognition." The boys in the hallway exchanged glances, surprise replacing their usual guarded expressions. Angela remained silent, her face unreadable. "I can't undo the past," Michael acknowledged, "but I can try to correct it going forward. Your recipes, your creativity, your talent, they deserve to be recognized, and not just within the restaurant. I'll make sure every food critic, every reviewer knows the truth about your contributions." "You think you can just buy my forgiveness with a job offer?" Angela's voice was sharp, but Michael noticed a slight tremor in it. "No," he replied honestly. "I don't expect forgiveness. This isn't about making me feel better. It's about giving you the opportunity you should have had from the start. It's about setting the record straight." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "I've already drafted emails to every major food publication in the city. I want to tell them the truth about the woman behind many of Luciano's most celebrated dishes. Your story deserves to be told, Angela." Angela stood and walked to the window, her back to Michael. The rain had stopped, leaving the street outside glistening under the streetlights. For a long moment, only the soft hum of the refrigerator broke the silence. "Mom?" Jacob's voice was tentative, hopeful. "Maybe you should consider it." Angela turned back slowly, her eyes meeting Michael's with a mix of caution and something that might have been hope. "Equal partnership?" she asked. "Complete creative freedom?" Michael nodded firmly. "And public recognition for all your contributions, past and present. It's time for Luciano's to honor all its creators." For the first time that evening, Angela's stern expression softened slightly. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. "That's all I can promise right now." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Michael saw it in the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, in the cautious optimism that crept into her sons' faces. Sometimes, he realized, the path to redemption begins not with grand gestures, but with simple acknowledgement of the truth. The following days were a blur of activity for Michael. He sat in his office at Luciano's bistro, surrounded by papers and his laptop, working tirelessly to transform his promises into reality. His first call was to David Chen, a respected food critic who had covered the restaurant's rise to prominence. "David," Michael began, his voice carrying the weight of his purpose, "I need to correct something important about Luciano's history." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm listening, Michael." As Michael detailed Angela's contributions and his plans to rectify past oversights, he could hear David's occasional sharp intake of breath. The critic had written some of the most glowing reviews of the dishes that he now knew were Angela's creations. "This is significant," David said finally. "You realize this will change how people view the restaurant's story?" "It should," Michael replied firmly. "It's time for the true story to be told." After hanging up, Michael began drafting a formal press release. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he carefully chose each word, knowing that this document would reshape not only his restaurant's narrative, but Angela's professional legacy as well. He created a new position within the restaurant's structure, co-executive chef, with equal authority and creative control. The contract he drew up specified not only salary and benefits, but also included explicit credit requirements for menu items and media appearances. Every dish of Angela's would be properly attributed. Every interview would acknowledge her role in the restaurant's success. Next, he called a staff meeting. Standing before his employees in the restaurant's dining room, Michael took a deep breath before speaking. "There's someone important returning to Luciano's," he announced. "Someone who helped build this place, though many of you won't know her name. That's going to change." He watched their faces as he explained Angela's history with the restaurant and her impending return. Some of the older staff members exchanged knowing looks. They remembered her talent and creativity. "When Angela returns," Michael continued, "she'll be joining us as co-executive chef. Her recipes, her innovations have been part of our success all along. It's time we acknowledge that properly." In his office later that evening, Michael reviewed the changes to the menu layout. Each dish would now carry a creator attribution. Carter family salt cod croquettes, Angela's Portuguese seafood stew, simple changes that carried the weight of years of unacknowledged contributions. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then dialed Angela's number. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice cautious but not hostile. "The paperwork is ready," he told her. "Everything we discussed, and maybe a bit more. Would you be willing to come in tomorrow to review it?" The silence on the other end stretched for a moment before she replied, "I'll be there at 10. The morning Angela walked back into Luciano's bistro, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. She arrived precisely at 10, dressed professionally but simply, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Michael noticed how she paused almost imperceptibly at the threshold, as if gathering her strength before crossing it. The restaurant was closed for regular service, but the staff was there preparing for the evening ahead. They looked up as she entered, their activities slowing as they recognized the significance of the moment. "Welcome back," Michael said softly, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Angela shook it. They settled in his office where the contract waited on his desk. Angela read each page carefully, her reading glasses perched on her nose, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. Michael watched as her eyebrows rose at certain sections, the profit-sharing agreement, the creative control guarantees, the media appearance requirements. "You're serious about this?" she said finally, looking up from the papers. "Completely," Michael replied. "The press release goes out this afternoon, with or without your signature. The world should know your contributions, regardless of what you decide." Angela's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the pen. Years of suppressed dreams and buried hopes seemed to surface in her eyes as she signed her name on each marked line. The scratch of pen on paper felt like the writing of a new chapter. After the signing, Michael gave her a tour of the kitchen. Her kitchen now, too. The staff straightened as she passed, responding to the natural authority in her bearing. At the prep station, she paused, running her fingers lightly over the smooth stainless steel surface. "We've upgraded some equipment," Michael explained, "but the heart of the kitchen is the same." Angela nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The heart," she repeated softly. Then, with a more businesslike tone, "The seafood menu needs work, and your sauce program." She trailed off, already lost in possibilities. Michael couldn't help but smile. This was the Angela he remembered, passionate, focused, already seeing ways to improve and create. As she moved through the kitchen, occasionally stopping to inspect something or ask a question, the staff watched with growing interest. This wasn't just a new chef joining their ranks. This was someone coming home. Before leaving, Angela turned to Michael. "My sons, they'd like to see the kitchen sometime. They've heard my stories for years, but they've never—" "Bring them any time," Michael said immediately. "They should see where their mother creates her magic." For the first time, Angela's smile reached her eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward something new. As she left the restaurant, her head held high, Michael knew that Luciano's bistro would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be. The first month of Angela's return to Luciano's bistro was a delicate dance of old wounds and new beginnings. The kitchen staff quickly learned to navigate between two distinct leadership styles, Michael's methodical precision and Angela's intuitive creativity. What could have been a recipe for chaos instead became an unexpected symphony of culinary excellence. On her third day back, Angela brought in an old, worn notebook, its pages yellow with age and spotted with cooking stains. "These are the originals," she said, placing it carefully on the prep table. "My grandmother's recipes, with my notes over the years." The gesture wasn't lost on Michael. This was Angela sharing not just recipes, but her heritage, her story, her trust. The changes in the menu were gradual but significant. Each week, they would introduce one or two of Angela's dishes, properly credited and presented with her personal touch. The critics noticed. Reviews began to mention the revolutionary partnership at Luciano's, praising the seamless blend of classical technique and personal history in each new dish. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of tension when old habits threatened to resurface. During a particularly busy Saturday service, Angela and Michael found themselves disagreeing over the presentation of a new seafood dish. "This isn't just about plating," Angela had said, her voice tight with emotion. "This is about respecting the tradition behind the dish." Michael had started to argue, then stopped himself, remembering the lessons of the past months. "Show me," he said instead. "Show me how your grandmother would have wanted it." These moments of potential conflict became opportunities for growth, for both of them. The staff watched as their two head chefs learned to navigate their shared space, their different approaches merging into something greater than either could have achieved alone. Jacob and Ethan began spending time at the restaurant after school, doing homework at a corner table, and watching their mother in her element. Michael noticed how they gradually relaxed in his presence, their initial hostility softening into cautious acceptance. One evening, he overheard Jacob telling a server, "That's my mom's dish," with unmistakable pride in his voice as he pointed to a special on the menu. The simple statement carried the weight of years of vindication. 6 months after Angela's return, Luciano's Bistro hosted a special event. The restaurant was closed to regular service, the tables rearranged to create an intimate gathering space. Food critics, industry leaders, and regular patrons filled the room, drawn by the promise of a unique celebration of culinary heritage. Michael stood at the front of the dining room, glass in hand. The buzz of conversation died down as he cleared his throat. "Tonight," he began, "we're not just celebrating food. We're celebrating truth, redemption, and the power of second chances." He glanced at Angela, who stood with her sons near the kitchen doors. 6 months ago, I learned that success built on overlooked contributions is no success at all. Tonight, we're setting the record straight." He gestured to the special menu cards placed at each setting. "Every dish you'll taste tonight has a story. Some were created in my grandmother's kitchen in Italy. Others," he nodded toward Angela, "were perfected in a Portuguese grandmother's kitchen across the ocean. Together, they tell the true story of Luciano's Bistro." Angela stepped forward, her professional chef's coat crisp and white, her name embroidered alongside Michael's on the breast pocket. The confidence in her bearing was unmistakable. This was a woman who had reclaimed her place in the world. "Food is memory," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's family, tradition, and pride. Every dish we serve here carries the weight of generations, the love of mothers and grandmothers who cooked not for fame but for family." She smiled at her sons, who beamed back at her. "Tonight, we honor those traditions by telling their whole story." The evening unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Each course came with a story, Michael and Angela taking turns explaining the origins and evolution of each dish. The critics scribbled notes furiously, but it was the regular patrons who seemed most moved, discovering new depths to flavors they thought they knew. As the night drew to a close, Michael found himself in the kitchen with Angela, watching as she put the finishing touches on the last dessert course, her grandmother's Portuguese custard tarts, perfectly caramelized on top. "Thank you," he said quietly. Angela looked up, her hands still moving with practiced precision. "For what?" "For giving me the chance to make things right, for showing me what true success looks like." She smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "You know," she said, sliding the tarts onto serving plates, "my grandmother used to say that the secret to good cooking isn't in the ingredients or even the technique. It's in the truth you put into each dish." Jacob and Ethan appeared at the kitchen door, their faces proud as they watched their mother work. Michael noticed how they no longer flinched when he was near, how they had begun to see the kitchen as a place of healing rather than hurt. "Mom," Jacob called out, "they're asking for you out there. Someone from that food magazine wants to talk about your cod croquettes." Angela straightened her chef's coat, sharing a quick glance with Michael. "Well," she said, "shall we go tell them the real story?" As they walked together toward the dining room, Michael realized that Luciano's Bistro had become more than just a successful restaurant. It had become a place of second chances, of restored dignity, of shared triumph. The prestigious reviews and packed reservations were no longer the measure of success he valued most. Instead, it was in the pride on Jacob and Ethan's faces as they watched their mother shine, in the genuine collaboration that had replaced old resentments, and in the knowledge that finally, every dish told its true story. The sweet aroma of the custard tarts filled the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter and conversation from the dining room. This, Michael thought, was what real success tasted like. Not just excellent food, but truth, redemption, and the joy of things made right.